Good morning and welcome. My name is Warren Klein, and on behalf of the Temple Emanuel Stryker Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual program exploring 9 centuries of Jewish life, the HUC JIR Library Collection. For almost 150 years, the Klau Library at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, has been amassing rare memorabilia of Jewish life and lore, religion, and culture. Now, the largest collection of Judaica and Hebraica outside the National Library of Israel, it's a cornucopia of prayer books, lavishly illustrated Haggadot, wood and copper engraved bookplates, posters, printed maps, and even a Yizkor book written in both Hebrew and Chinese. Yoram Biton and Jordan Finken will serve as our tour guides through this fascinating treasure trove and the critical moments in Jewish history they reflect. If you have questions, please submit them via the chat function, and we will try to get to as many as possible at the very end. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Rayfeld, the 10th president of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, the academic and spiritual and professional leadership development center of Reform Judaism. A leading political scientist and distinguished Jewish communal leader, Dr. Rayfeld previously served as tenured faculty member in political science at Washington University, and as president and CEO of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rayfeld.
Thank you so much, Warren. It is a great pleasure to bring greetings on behalf of the Board of Governors, faculty, students, and staff of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, the seminary and institution of graduate studies of Reform Judaism that prepares leaders for Jewish communities throughout North America, Israel, and around the world. And I want to thank you for joining us for this special program, which really reflects the abiding relationship between our institution and Temple Emanuel and clergy there. Our alumni have served Temple Emanuel for over a century as your rabbis, cantors, educators, and scholars. Generations of our students have served as student rabbis, student cantors, and teachers there. Members of our faculty have taught at your congregation and in the Stryker Center. Notably Rabbi Larry Hoffman, who has guided your institutional planning, and more recently, Rabbi Joe Skloot. Your congregation has provided generous student scholarships and support for our library throughout the decades. And a number of our board members are proud members of your community as well. And every year, our ordination and graduation ceremonies take place in your magnificent sanctuaries, sending off a new cohort of Jewish leaders who will strengthen Jewish education, engagement, and identity throughout the Jewish world. Historically, HUC's relationship with Temple Emanuel actually goes back to the mid-19th century, to the very founding of our institution. And at one point, we actually had competing seminaries, but fortunately, we're all here to work together. And so Temple Emanuel's goal of ensuring a vibrant rabbinate for American Jewry lives on at HUC and continues to be part of our mission. Our world-renowned library, the subject of today's program, began with the very inception of Hebrew Union College. Over time, it has grown, as Warren said, to be the largest Jewish library outside of Israel in quantity and quality of holdings. It preserves thousands of rare illuminated manuscripts, biblical codices, communal records, legal documents, and scientific tracts dating back to the 10th century. We have 750,000 printed books, plus or minus a few, I'm certain. The preeminent collection of American Jewish periodicals is within our collection. Haggadot, maps, prayer books, bookplates, stamps, theater posters, and more, including an exquisite collection of music. Our library's extraordinary resources serve our students, our faculty, international researchers, and you, the public. We invite you to visit our library treasures at our campuses in New York, Cincinnati, Los Angeles, and Jerusalem, and we hope you will help support our library and its mission. Guiding our library with vision and creativity is Yoram Biton, Director of Libraries, who's joined here today by Dr. Jordan Finken, rare book and manuscript librarian, and noted scholar of Yiddish literature. They will present our treasures to you in what I am sure will be an engaging and informative program. Please join me in welcoming Yoram Biton and Dr. Jordan Finken.
Thank you. So thank you, President Rayfeld, and good morning. Welcome to the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion virtual event, exploring 9 centuries of Jewish life. In this presentation, we will highlight the treasures of the HUC Library collection. I would like to thank Dr. Gadi Levy, the Executive Director of the Temple Emmanuel Stryker Center, for the invitation to speak today. I also want to thank President Rayfeld for his introduction and Dr. Jordan Finken for his willingness to be a tour guide through the library treasures. With over 1 million items, including books, manuscripts, microfilms, maps, broadsides, bookplates, music scores, stamps, and much more, the HUC libraries have the largest Judaica collection in the Western Hemisphere and is second in size only to the Judaica collection at the National Library of Israel. The HUC JR library system is spread into libraries on our 4 campuses: the Klau Library in Cincinnati, the Klau Library in New York, the Francis Henry Library in Los Angeles, and the Abramov Library in Jerusalem. Rabbi Isaac Meir Weiss, who founded the college in 1875, established its library from the very inception of the institution. With the dedication of its first library building in 1912, HUC Library became the first freestanding Jewish library in the world history. The library started in 1875 with 130 volumes, nearly all of which were textbooks. Among the earliest donors of books was Sir Moshe Montefiore, who sent from London a set of the Warsaw edition of the Bible, Mikal Delot, with his autograph dedication. Little by little, year by year, the library started to acquire the libraries of famous collectors. To mention some, our president, Rabbi Isaac Meir Weiss, and Dr. Samuel Adler, a rabbi of Temple Emmanuel. Also, there were also donations of items from the library of Temple Emmanuel. In addition, every afternoon in the summer, the librarian of the college used to go to Europe for a rare book and manuscript hunting. By 1925, when the college celebrated its 50th anniversary, the library owned around 160,000 volumes and became one of the largest Judaica and Hebraica collections in the world. The Klau Library's mission is to collect, preserve, and provide access to the total record of Jewish thought and experience. Today, you will get a taste of our collection, which include, as I mentioned before, rare books, manuscripts, incunabula, archival and literary archival materials and literary manuscript, including the Chinese manuscript that we will see later on today. Also, permanent collection of Jewish music, including the Edward Birnbaum collection of Jewish music, which is the largest collection of sacred synagogue music in the world. Also, the American Jewish Periodical Center, which preserves some 900 newspapers, journals, and synagogue bulletin titles from America. In addition, the library houses early Jewish Americana, Spinozana, Christian Hebraica, Inquisition reports, and much, much, much more. The library has also embraced the digital age. We built 2 websites that are dedicated to our special collections. So far, we have around 10,000 digitized images of works from our collections that are available to the public. Manuscripts can be seen at mss.huc.edu, and our music images can at music.huc.edu. I encourage you to visit these beautiful websites and explore their manuscripts. Today, a few years from the 150th anniversary of the college, with more than 1 million items in the collection, the HUC JR libraries are one of the most comprehensive Jewish libraries in the world and has the largest collection of printed Judaica in North America. The HSC Library is an unparalleled international center for research, teaching, and learning for scholars worldwide, and enhances the intellectual and cultural life of Jews in America. Now, I would like to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Jordan Finken. Dr. Finken is a rare book and manuscript librarian at the Klau Library of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, having earned his doctorate at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Finken continued his scholarly career as a specialist in modern Yiddish literature. He is the author of several books, as well as numerous scholarly essays and articles. Please welcome Dr. Finken.
Thank you, Yoram. And thank you, of course, to the Stryker Center and to all of you for being here. We only have a very short amount of time to go through. It's very hard to choose which are the cream of the crop to talk about, but let me get right into it. The Klau Library has a relatively small collection from the Cairo Geniza. And for those of you who don't know what a Geniza is, those items that are considered sacred or even that have the Hebrew language on them are sort of segregated. They can't be destroyed. And they're placed in a different receptacle or reservoir or room in the synagogue. And the heaps and hundreds of thousands of discarded manuscripts kept in the Fustat synagogue is known as the Cairo Geniza, which was famously revealed to the world by Solomon Schechter. Now, what the Klau Library's collection lacks in size, it makes up for in significance. And one very important scrap comes from the life of Johannes of Oppido, otherwise known as Ovadia Hager, or Obadiah the proselyte. Johannes was born in the second half of the 11th century in southern Italy to a Norman family, and he became a monk. What we know is that following the model of the Bishop of Bari, the century earlier, who had converted to Judaism, Johannes himself converted in 1102 and took the name Ovadia. He subsequently undertook a tour of the Middle East, a sort of Levantine Grand Tour, and composed music. What we know of his life comes completely from documents discovered in the Cairo Geniza. And they are 7 leaves of memoir, a genre that was still highly unusual in that period, 3 separate musical compositions, unique for being the only known setting of Hebrew prayers to Gregorian chant, and a single surviving leaf of a liturgy that Ovadia made for his personal use.
One second, the PowerPoint, can you change to, it's still music.
It's not letting, oh, there we go. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, the liturgical leaf is immensely important because it's signed by Ovadia himself and specifically dates his conversion to 1102. This is the document that we have in the Klau Library. Here we see Ovadia Hager HaNormandus Asher Ba Bivrit Elohei Yisrael B'Yerach Elul Hu Ovadia Hager Katav Biado. Ovadia the Norman proselyte who entered the covenant of the God of Israel in the month of Elul 1102. Ovadia the proselyte has written this in his own hand. Now, one of the things I love about this really delicate fragment is just how schmutzy it is. Its time in the Geniza clearly shows, and there is something important about the accretions of dust and dirt that give history an actual tangible feel to them. But the significance of this little scrap transcends the physical. It's a vital example of how a couple of little lines of text can tell an immense story, and points out why the work of the Klau Library is so essential today to preserving Jewish heritage and history. Moving a little further into the medieval period, we'll turn to what are usually the eye catchers of any Judaica collection, namely the Illuminated Hagadot. These are often the most storied texts in a collection, and ours is no different. The Klau Library holds a number of beautiful and important illuminated Haggadot. And by way of background, the Haggadah, the text that accompanies the Passover meal, is one of the few ritual texts that are allowed to be decorated and indeed illuminated. And in the Middle Ages, there was a vogue for sumptuously decorated manuscripts. And that fascination with their illustrations continues to this day. Just go to any Judaica store and look at the Haggadah section, and you'll see what I mean. When certain manuscripts attain a degree of notoriety, they tend to get names. And often the names come from where they end up, not from where they were produced. So the famous Sarajevo Haggadah, if you recall Geraldine Brooks's People of the Book, which was produced in Spain, is so called because it is housed at the National Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo. Now, in any event, of our two Cincinnati Haggadahs, the first, let's look at the first Cincinnati Haggadah, the darling, I'd say, of our collection. It was written in ink and pigment on parchment and was produced at the end of the 15th century in Heidelberg in Germany, probably 1490s, by a scribe and artist named Meyer Jaffe. We know these facts from a colophon at the end. Now, what I like to tell students when I teach about rare books is that if they get nothing else out of the class, at least they'll have a good vocabulary for erudite cocktail party conversation. So a colophon is that bit of a manuscript, usually at the end, but not always, in which the scribe tells something about the who, what, when, and where of the manuscript's production. Something like, I, Heckle Schmeckle, made this book in such and such a place and such a date. That's how we know that Meyer Jaffe made this particular Haggadah, and we'll get to the colophon in just a moment. But let's start. We have the first page here up on your screen, and if we up close to the upper panel, you'll see instantly the depth and richness of the illumination that's involved in this work, and it's truly an exceptional piece of work. You'll notice, of course, that on the right-hand side is the Bedikat Chametz, is the man with the feather searching for Chametz. Now you'll see that unless he's got rich, deep shag carpet, this lovely piece of furniture is located out on the lawn. Now, why would it be out on the lawn? Well, it's a gesture to how he has to get rid of the chametz, which is to say, you could burn it, but in medieval cities, you weren't allowed to make fires outside. So he'd go to the end of his property and throw it away and declare it that he's no longer the owner. Now, if he's no longer the owner, who is? Well, the birds that you will notice up here at the top of the illumination. And these birds fly throughout the text. They appear on numerous leaves. So not only was Meyer Jaffe a wonderful artist, but he was also a puckish one as well. Now, if we continue, here is another leaf. Now you'll look at this first leaf, you'll notice the border. And on this leaf, it has a different border. Now, each leaf of this Haggadah has a unique border, which is very unusual for illuminated Haggadahs of this period. Now, likely this was added later, but even so, it's a significant element of the visual effect of the piece. You'll also notice the rich gilt work, gilding of many of these leaves, as well as this is an equally schmutzy book. You'll see the wine stains or other stains here. I've often said that this was a book that was used. It was actually used and loved by the families that owned it. And I've often wanted to do a DNA analysis to see if we can get a recipe for Heidelberg Charosis circa 1490, but that takes a different level of funding than the library would have. We also notice over on the left bottom that there are doodles. There's white space and there are doodles. So you give a book to a kid, and what is a kid going to do? We see doodling in here. And at the top, of course, the illustration, and I will zoom in on that. So if Passover falls after the Sabbath, you have to finish the Sabbath and start the festival, and you do that with a certain set of prayers made in a particular order. They have to be said in a particular order. And this in bold print here are the prayers, the names of the prayers you have to say. Yain Kiddush Der Havdalah Zman. Now, Jews love acronyms. So if you look right above that, you'll see Yud Kuf Nun He Zayin, the first letters of that right? Which says acronym Yaknahaz, which doesn't mean anything. It just means the names of the blessings. However, this being medieval Germany, Yaknahaz kind of sounds like Jagdinhase, which means to hunt the hare. And what we have below is a hare hunt. So this is a visual pun. It's a mnemonic device, but it's a visual pun, right? It's also amusing because while there were Jewish hunters, there was not a major Jewish occupation. And one doesn't generally go hare hunting with a boar spear. It's an amusing bit of fun. What's interesting, though, about these kinds of images is that once printing comes in, the images, and this is not the only Yaknahaz image in a medieval manuscript, that these images, these popular images in these manuscripts, become set into the printed Haggadahs in woodcut, woodblock prints. And they become so popular, they become the furniture of the text. You can't imagine a Haggadah without a hare hunt. Indeed, some don't even have the Hebrew at all. All you have is the picture. Hamevin Yavin, the one, if you understand, right? That a picture's worth 1,000 words, and that's what you get. Now, I could go on and on about this picture because I love it so much, but I will move on to the colophon that I promised earlier. Now, by the end of the Haggadah, you've had 4 cups of wine, so your eyes might be need a little extra help. And the letters in this Haggadah get progressively larger. And by the end, we get to the colophon, which has the largest letters in the entire Haggadah. I, Meyer Yaffe, made this book, and don't you forget it, right? He reserves to himself the biggest letters of the entire book, which adds another level to the personality of Meyer Yaffe. Now, one last thing to note before we move on is up in the upper left-hand corner over here, you'll notice there's writing. Just like you buy a nice book, you put your name in it. What's changed since 1490? These are previous owners have written their names in. Now, what's interesting in this book is that many of the previous owners seem to have been women. So they passed down in the women's side, which is interesting detail. And this one here in the cartouche is especially lovely because it's a Toivlein, Bat Rav Yisachar, and she dates it to 1548 or 1549. And of course, her name is Toivlein, which in German and Yiddish means little dove. And there's the little dove at the top of the cartouche that she's either wrote herself or has had written for her into the cartouche. So here, even though women are not overly represented in the textual corpus that we have revealed, their names do come to the surface, and we can get grab glimpses of them. So let me move on. Staying, however, in the medieval period, let's take a quick look at manuscript 652, and I will note again that where we have them digitized, I have the manuscript website address located here, so you can peruse many of these texts at your leisure. This is a miscellany, a group of miscellaneous texts completed in 1393 in Wernigerode in central Germany. It includes portions of the Bible, a Sabbath liturgy, and selected other prayers, a collection of local customary practices, Sefer Mitzvot Katan of Yitzchak ben Yosef of Corbeil, which has to do with the 613 commandments, and the Sha'arei Dura of Yitzchak ben Meir of Duran, a standard work on Jewish dietary law. These kinds of miscellaneous collections were not uncommon in the period, a kind of practical religious encyclopedia. But what makes this book so enjoyable are the wonderfully medieval decorations. And you'll see here on the left, you've got a castle and a couple of dragons fighting at the bottom. In the middle ground of that picture, you'll see swirling wheels of rabbits. Elsewhere, you hear in the middle is another swirling wheel of rabbits. I don't know what it is about medieval German Jewry, but they seem to love rabbits. Here in the bottom, we have Eruv Tavshilin, which is a legalistic cooking practice for Sabbaths that fall immediately after the holiday. And you have this fellow here who's clearly making the food for Eruv Tavshilin. And on the right, you have this group. I assume there are foxes in this case because their tails are too long and their ears are too short, but all doing very anthropomorphic foxes. But here, right next to the Erev Tavshilin before, we've got a fox doing exactly the same practice and all kinds of other activities. It's very delightful kinds of pictures that you get here. But what I find so engaging about this text also are the moments of intimacy that stretch 600 years into the past. Here we see a place in the text, small, this is very small, this portion, in which the name of Avraham, you'll see right here, Avraham, is mentioned. In the margin, the copyist, whose name we know is Avraham ben Shmuel, which we know from the Colophon. This book has a Colophon, which is also how we know that's dated from exactly to 1393. He has drawn a picture of himself in typical scribe's uniform, pointing at his own name in the text. It's just a moment of whimsy and personality, but it humanizes the text in a very real and concrete way and offers the kind of surreptitious pleasure that manuscripts so often afford. Now, from the surreptitious to the outright clandestine, let's move on to manuscript 13. Here we have a Bible manuscript produced in Spain, likely in about the 14th century. It's the second half of a Bible whose other half is housed at the University of Cambridge. Now, it's written on incredibly supple parchment, probably uterine vellum, and it's beautifully, it's gorgeously illuminated. The manuscript is a Masoretic Bible. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, it's one that contains a system of vowel points and cantillation marks, as well as the authoritative text of the Bible, as established by a group of scholars in Palestine, known as the Masoretes, hence a Masoretic text, at the end of the first millennium. A Masoretic Bible is one that uses that system, as well as in containing the apparatus. And you'll see that the apparatus is usually written in the column, in between the columns here, on the outside margins and on the top and bottom margins. It's highly technical. It tells you things like how many times a particular word is used, whether the spelling is different from other places in the, all kinds of scribal details. It's very technical and not really meant to be read. It just had to be there nonetheless. That sort of tells you that this is an authoritative Bible. What we see in this manuscript is indeed the apparatus in the columns, in between the columns on the outer margins. However, the text up here in the top and in the bottom is not the Masoretic notes and technical apparatus, but rather Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, a work of philosophy that has almost nothing to do with the Bible, certainly not a commentary on the Bible as you might expect. Well, it's not uncommon for unrelated texts to go in the margins of manuscripts. This is expensive material, right? And if there's blank space, you put something in it. But for a sumptuously decorated biblical text, it's very unusual. There's speculation as to what it's doing here at all. It may have been commissioned, true, by someone with erudite, if quirky tastes, but given the controversy that raged in medieval Europe, especially in northern Spain and in southern France, over the acceptability of Maimonides' philosophy, not his religious work, but his philosophical work, perhaps this is a case of hiding in plain sight, since there was very little likelihood that the technical apparatus would ever be consulted. Maybe it's just hiding there so that you could consult it and no one would ever really check if it's something that illicit that shouldn't be used. From Spain on the eve of the Inquisition, let's move half a world away to China in the 12th century. That's when Persian Jewish traders started to ply the Silk Road. And as they moved into China, they set down settlements, married, the settlements grew, and the Chinese Jewish population was in a number of places, but particularly strong in Kaifeng, the old imperial capital. Now, by the mid-19th century, the 1850s, this was a smaller community and very poor. but a group in England called the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Amongst the Jews, a missionary society, got wind of the Chinese Jews and went off to do what missionaries do. And they found a very impoverished community, and they arranged to purchase the manuscripts. 64 manuscripts in all were sent to Shanghai to be copied. Eventually, they were moved to London, and in the 1920s, our then illustrious librarian Adolf Oko arranged for the purchase of 59, which makes Hebrew Union College Cincinnati the holder of the largest single collection of Chinese manuscripts in the world. Now, there's so much you could say about these. I will just make a couple of points. These books, most of them date to the mid-1600s, are of two sorts, either liturgies, liturgical materials, or biblical texts. Now, you'll see on the right-hand side, it's a liturgy, which is pointed with the vowel points. But the little bit of text that's not in vowel points is in Judeo-Persian. So these are, by the 17th century, these Jews are speaking Chinese, but they are maintaining their Judeo-Persian is a quasi-liturgical language. It's meant for liturgical directions. You know, this we say out loud, now we stand, that kind of thing. That's an interesting element. In one of the Sabbath liturgies, at the end, someone has compiled a list of members of the Jewish community in Kaifeng as far back as anyone in the community could remember, and some of these have been dated to the Ming Dynasty, and has composed a Yizkor book, a memorial book. And that's what you see on the left-hand side of your screen. With Chinese names where available, or if in the absence of a Hebrew name, if that's the only name that's available. So you'll see at the top is the Chinese characters and then Ben Levi. So it's someone, son of Levi, and someone, Ben Yisrael. So it is a remarkable unique historical document of Chinese Jewry. And one of the few places that you'll see Chinese and Hebrew in the same place. So while not as unique a collection as the Chinese manuscripts, the Klau Library nevertheless holds an important collection of decorated Esther scrolls. Most of the Klau Library's decorated Esther scroll collection form part of the Kirstein collection. Now, Sally Kirstein, who lived 1869 to 1935, if my notes are correct here, was a prominent businessman in Berlin who was very active in Jewish communal affairs. He also amassed a significant collection of Jewish art and ritual objects. A goodly portion of this collection was acquired by the Klau Library, again by Oko, including one of the great collections of 16th and 17th century illuminated Esther scrolls. Our scrolls have all been cataloged, and there's some lovely videos from Sharon Mintz on this, and I urge you to go and watch those lectures because they're just, dare I say, illuminating. But I just focus on this one for the moment. The Esther Scroll, or Megillah, is a ritual text whose recitation is required every year on the holiday of Purim. Unlike the Torah scroll, however, there's no prohibition on decorating it. However, surprisingly, despite that fact, the earliest known decorated Esther scroll and is dated to only 1564. The lateness of this appearance of decorated Megillot is still something of a mystery. However, after this time, the genre seems to have blossomed first in Italy and later in the Netherlands and into Germany. Among the many fine Esther scrolls that the Klau Library holds, the earliest is the second oldest dated Esther scroll, decorated Esther scroll, I should say, which is the one you're looking at, produced in Rome between 1570 and 1572. Has borders printed off of copper plate engravings with text filled in later subsequently by a scribe. Now, in any event, the borders were produced by the Roman engraver Andrea Marelli for a much different book. Blank sheets of the parchment with these printed borders were then repurposed for use as an Esther scroll. The somewhat risque, although given the content of the Scroll of Esther, which has some bawdy material, maybe not unexpected, but the somewhat risque and certainly not particularly Jewish content of the imagery you see here seems to have been no hindrance to its use for a ritual text, and provides remarkable evidence, I think, for the hybridity of Jewish culture, with Jewish artists completely open to the adaptation of decorative arts of the locations in which they produced their work. Now, while we're on the subject of Purim scrolls, the model of Purim as a holiday spawned other celebrations of local Jewish redemption, especially in Europe. An important example is the so-called Purim di Buda. During the Austro-Turkish War at the end of the 17th century, Austrian forces besieged the Turkish-held city of Buda, which is part of what is now Budapest. The Austrian troops were opposed by Turks as well as by Jews. Now, as a result, a wave of anti-Jewish sentiment broke out in parts of Europe, especially in the Italian states, including Padua. The local authorities went on to thwart a mob attack on the ghetto on the 10th of Elul in 1684. The local Christian authorities protected the Jewish community. This seemingly miraculous redemption prompted an annual celebration of a local Purim, the Purim known as the Purim di Buda. This manuscript is an 18th century scroll in imitation of the Esther scroll. Okay, if you're going to have a Purim, you're going to have a scroll. An imitation of the Esther scroll, which contains a hymn recited annually by the Jewish community in Padua. Now, if I move back just briefly, I mentioned the printed borders on the Esther scroll a moment ago, so I want to turn to the age of print and one of my absolutely favorite books in our collection. In 1514, a Genoese Dominican, an Orientalist named Agostino Giustiniani, who is the Bishop of Nebbio, undertook the production of a polyglot Bible. Now, unlike a Bible in translation, which is usually produced alone or alongside the original, a polyglot Bible contains side-by-side translations from several different languages simultaneously. In response to the growing interest of Christian scholars in biblical sources, Giustiniani, right, he saw a market. Basically, we have a lot of Christian scholars who are now working on biblical texts, so he sees a market. So he sought to capitalize on this interest with producing a printed polyglot Bible that he could sell. But it was an expensive undertaking. You had to procure manuscripts for all of these things. You have to manage all the editors. You have to cut type in multiple languages. You have to set all that type, and so on and so forth. And a project that, I have to add, he was funding personally. So he set about to test the market. He's not going to do the whole Bible. So he's going to test the market for such a work with a single book. What book would you choose? It's got to be little and popular, right? So he chooses the Psalms. He ultimately goes on to produce 2,000 copies, 50 of which are on vellum. And it was a complete commercial flop. It was a disaster. He couldn't give them away. So he gave up the project completely, and he never produced any further books of the Bible. However, what he did produce, and I have to say, it was printed by a printer named Petrus Paulus Porus, a wonderful alliterative name. But you'll see I put his printer's mark here on the lower right-hand side. Also kind of puckish, because porous in Latin means leak. So he's put his name and his last name as the leak. So he's Peter Paul the Leak. Maybe he was Welsh, I don't know. But we do have the Genoa Polyglot Psalms, and which is the first printed polyglot of any individual biblical book. And it's a remarkable feat. So moving from left to right, you'll see the original Hebrew, the Vulgate Latin, as well as a new Latin translation, the Greek Septuagint, an Arabic, the Onkelos Aramaic translation, and because that was such an authoritative and ancient translation, next you have a Latin translation of the Onkelos, and finally Scholia, which is just a fancy schmancy word for footnotes. This book represents the first printed Arabic text of a biblical book, and only the second printed Arabic text using movable type. Now, what's really interesting, especially interesting about this particular page, is that we find in Psalm 19 the text, and the words of the Lord are gone out to the ends of the world. The typical prophetic boilerplate kind of language, the words of the Lord going to the ends of the earth. But if we see the footnote to that text in the right, Igis tur Christoforo Columbus cognomento Columbus patria genuensis, which is to say, Christopher Columbus, look, he's fulfilling the prophecy that the word of the Lord will go to the ends of the earth. The book was printed in 1516, so this was still fresh news. And of course, Columbus was from Genoa, and the book was printed in Genoa. So this is a great example of publicity. Native son makes good. This reference is also the very first mention of Christopher Columbus's name in print as a footnote to the Bible. All of those make this just a wonderful book. I mean, you just look at the scholarship that's available at your fingertips with something like this. Now, so much of what we do in rare book and manuscript world is to tell good stories like that. So I'm going to take a break from the medieval world and the Renaissance world to tell another good story. In 1920, the British government decided to transfer administration of Palestine from military to civilian control. And to that end, it appointed Herbert Samuel as High Commissioner for Palestine and schlepped him off to Jerusalem to assume control from then Major General Louis Bolz. They met on June 30th, 1920 in General Bolz's office for the transfer of power, at which point, and I imagine a very tweedy meeting of British gentlemen, Bolz observed, and I imagine him again with tongue firmly planted in cheek and a wry smile, says something to the effect of, well, I suppose I'll need a receipt. So he took out a sheet of letterhead and Samuel wrote out, received from Major General Sir Louis Bolz, 1 Palestine, complete. A famous, if minor, episode in Zionist history, it was used as the title for Tom Segev's history of the mandatory period. And indeed, when the item was going up for auction in the early 1960s, the owner wanted to get some background information and contacted Samuel, who was in his 90s at that point. And Samuel was utterly incredulous. He said it was a joke. It has no historical value and you'd be lucky to get a penny for it. Eventually it was given as a gift to the college. And now we have a receipt for a country. So you never know what you're going to find. From the ridiculous to the sublime, I want to return to early Hebrew printing, switching gears a little bit, and mention the Venetian Christian printer with the deceptively Jewish sounding name, Daniel Bomberg, one of the very finest Hebrew printers, an exceptional craftsman, as well as a businessman. Bomberg pioneered grand editions of classic Jewish texts. In 1517, for example, he produced the Editio Princeps, again, for our erudite cocktail party conversation. Editio Princeps is the term of art for the first printed edition of a work previously only available in copied manuscripts. So the Editio Princeps of the Mikraot Gedolot, the Rabbinic Bible, which we saw a later edition of earlier. In many of his Bibles, he was one of the first printers regularly to use chapter and verse numbers, which is now more or less standard practice. Bomberg's beautiful imprints are known for their uncluttered crispness and clarity, and though these pictures don't quite do them justice, you can see just how perfect his printing can be. And no work speaks to those qualities more characteristically than his Editio Princeps of the complete Babylonian Talmud. Individual tractates had been printed in various places earlier, but Bomberg's Talmud, printed between 1519 and 1523, was the very first complete printed Talmud. In it, Bomberg fixed the layout with a central text of the Gemara of the Talmud, here we go, as well as with Rashi on the gutter and Tosafot on the outside, as well as foliation numbers up here, the leaf numbers, which are now standard. So we're still using Bomberg apparatus. Indeed, what we think of when we talk about the Talmud is largely of Bomberg's creation. These there are a dozen or so complete sets of Bomberg's Talmud. Most of them are actually mixtures of tractates from the 3 printings that Bomberg undertook. The Klau Library, however, holds a complete set of the very first printing in pristine condition. And I will show you. Come out. Here's one, a gesunte volume. That's a technical term, a gesunte book, with wooden boards covered in pigskin. The books come from the collection of James Ludovic Lindsay, the 26th Earl of Crawford. Now, Crawford was an English polymath and book collector who by the late 19th century had added to the family's already impressive holdings to make one of the finest private book collections in England, with nearly 200,000 books. After his death, straitened financial circumstances led Lindsay's son to part with large portions of the collection. Apocrypha has it that it was less straitened circumstances than the desire to build a tennis court, but I will let that be Apocrypha. Hebrew Union College's librarian, the colorful Adolf Oko, again, arranged for the purchase of the Talmud, as well as other important volumes in the 1920s. Now we're moving along. While individual books can be impressive in their own right, as we saw with Bomberg's Talmud, sometimes it is also a collection itself that offers food for wonder. And one of the wonders of the Klau Library is its Edward Birnbaum collection. Now, Edward Birnbaum, who lived between 1855 and 1920, was a cantor and music historian in Königsberg. As part of his lifelong interest in the history of Jewish music, especially choral music, he amassed an immense collection of musical manuscripts, the earliest from the mid-17th century, as well as early printed books, and his own musical notes on the synagogue music he heard as he traveled around Europe. In its totality, in the many thousands and thousands of items contained in the collection, it offers perhaps the most comprehensive soundscape of Jewish liturgical music in the world. Take, for example, this page. It's from a cantor's manual. It seems to have belonged to a one Yakutiel, a chorister in The Hague, in the Netherlands, in the latter half of the 18th century. It's through Birnbaum's collection that we can not only revive the sounds of a Dutch synagogue in 1750, but also, in a broader sense, preserve lost worlds, entire lost musical worlds from oblivion. Now, that is the amazing thing, I'd say, about the staggering collections of the Klau Library. They preserve unique, tangible connections to the Jewish past, to Jewish life, thought, culture, and civilization, like nowhere else in the world. The electricity of Jewish heritage is at your fingertips, and I'll bring it to an end there. Let me take this opportunity again to thank all of you for coming and listening, as well as to the Stryker Center for putting this all together. And I would ask that you consider supporting the work of the library, and in which case, please contact Yoram or me. And a sheinem dank.
Thank you so much, Jordan and Yoram. I think we have time for a couple of questions that have been coming in, if you're ready. So the first question comes to us, I believe, mostly in relation to the images you showed of the Cincinnati Haggadah. Can you address the use of human figures in illustrations? Is there any commentary authorizing it, or was it just accepted in general?
It was just accepted. It was an accepted practice. The thing that we notice about almost all illuminated manuscripts, certainly from the European world, is that they, Jews absorb sponge-like the written, the textual, the artistic cultures of the places where they lived. So very often the illuminations look, they might even have been done by Christian artists as well as Jewish, but they look like medieval European manuscripts in every regard except being in Hebrew, or sometimes the subject matter. So other than the bird's head Haggadah, which is an oddity, a very strange curiosity. Yeah, there was no proscription against visual representation of human beings. So.
All right, thanks. A couple questions coming in talking about the Bamberg Talmud being covered in pigskin. If you can talk a little bit about that. I think it kind of struck some curiosity with people about books being covered in pigskin, of course, not being written using that.
Of course. I get that question a lot about the Bamberg especially, but we have a number of Hebrew books in pigskin. It's a very tight, makes a very tight binding. It's a very good, it's a very durable material. And as long as it's dealt with in the proper way, which is, it's fit for, Maimonides said it's fit for use for things like bookbinding and that sort of thing. So it's not treif in that sense. It's not the most common thing in Jewish books, but it's definitely not a freak in this sense.
Right. I'm wondering if either of you can talk a little bit about conservation and preservation of the wonderful treasures that you've showed us. Do you have a conservation lab on site? How are these items protected and stored? I know we always get a lot of questions about that when we have these types of presentations.
Yes, so we do not have a lab. We would love to have a lab, but we do not have a lab. But we have a lab nearby that loves getting our stuff. It's a partnership between It's a partnership between the University of Cincinnati and the Public Library. But they take our stuff because they love our stuff and they've never seen things bound this way, that look this way, that give them these historical opportunities to handle this kind of material, and they're fantastic. They're utterly fantastic. So that's where we go. In-house, we do have I call it the vault, but we have a rare book room that's behind multiple layers of security. And of course, rare books like it cold and dry. So we need, it's all climate controlled and the whole this, that, and the other. The other question I always get is because I pick up a book like this, the Codex Curtisianus, and I leaf through the pages with my hands, and I invariably on a tour I get a question, where are the gloves? We don't use, that's for promotional materials. You're far more likely to look, the books have been around 500 years with people reading them, so clearly hands are not damaging them. But with gloves, you lose sensitivity, and also you can snag much more easily on a bit of fabric than you can on your hands. So it's just much safer, actually, ultimately, that way to use your hands. So yes, I mean, in every respect, we try to be as respectful of the book and to maintain it and to preserve it. God willing, for the next, how long does a book last? 600 years? For another 600 years, yeah.
Great. And I think we have time for just one more question, and maybe we can also, again, provide the link to the library where we can see some of these treasures that have been digitized. And of course, to all of you out there, a recording will be made available, so please check back on our website. But the last question, thinking about what you guys are currently collecting. I know in the museum world and different libraries have been collecting a lot of material that's been out there during the pandemic in terms of COVID, digital collections. Just wanted to know what was on your radar for contemporary collections added to your collection.
Yoram, do you want to chime in on that?
This is a big question that we can discuss later, but we still collect books, manuscripts, sometimes rare books. We still collect materials that are relevant to our collection.
I will say, historically, the library was not just historically, it is an integral, essential part of the college. When it was in its growth period, the idea was for it to be effectively a depository library of the Jewish experience throughout time. Now, as grand an idea as that is, and as bold and forward-thinking as our previous librarians have been, budgets are always the problem to that kind of grand plan. So we try as hard as possible to collect as much and as widely as possible to maintain that, both that idea and to serve our core constituencies, which are the faculty, staff, and students, ultimately the scholarly world in general. So we do collect ephemera and other kinds of things, but in terms of an active policy with regard to digital materials, COVID materials, that kind of stuff, it's not as it's not as easy for us to do that while still maintaining our core competencies. So we would love to, and we, of course, as I said before, we would love the support of the community to be able to do all the things that a library like this can and should be able to do. So
great. I think that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank our guides, Jordan and Yoram, and of course, Dr. Rayfeld. And please be sure to check out some of the treasures for yourself on the website provided. And everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.